Harvey Wyrick is not a man who walks away from a challenge. When he heard that former President Bush took his first parachute jump at the age of 80, he decided that if former President Bush could do it, he should be able to do it too. After thinking about it for a couple of years, he was ready to take the plunge. On the morning of July 10, 2004, at the age of 80, Harvey Wyrick went to the Goshen Airport near his home in northern Indiana. That morning, Wyrick, along with another 13 men and 2 women, underwent a 4-hour training session.
And we had class for 4 hours that morning. The instructor was a school teacher and that had made 2,500 jumps. And he told us he only used his emergency once, and everything seemed to work okay. And he told us that today, if we come down, why, first thing you want to do is look up and see if the chute's open. And he said, if it isn't open, you pull this handle. He gave us a lot of details on everything, how it works. And he said, that'll release that chute. He said, then you pull the other handle for the emergency chute. And he said, if that one doesn't work, you just come on down anyway and enjoy the ride. In the plane, when the instructor would hold his thumb up, well, that's when you were supposed to let loose of the wing. And it was all easy and beautiful. I had a beautiful ride. It was, of course, one of those new square parachutes. They're very maneuverable. And of course, I landed on the ground. And everybody come running over there, and they was very concerned the old man might have hurt himself. So I got up, of course, and got on the pickup and went back to the airport.
Wyrick received his first skydive certificate, and a note from his instructor said, Harvey, I had a great time being your jump master for your first jump. You are by far my favorite skydiver, and it was an honor for me to be able to see you take your first steps into the world of skydiving. Blue skies, Todd. What Todd, the instructor, didn't know was that this was not Harvey's first jump, or even his second or third jump. In fact, he had made 21 official jumps and 1 unofficial jump. But those jumps were made some 60 years ago. As a young man, Harvey took a leap of faith and became one of some 240 CO Smokejumpers during World War II. In 1871, there was a forest fire that swept across northern Wisconsin, killing some 1,500 people. The term firestorm dates back to that disaster. 1910 was also a disastrous fire season for the Pacific Northwest and the northern Rockies. In a matter of days, a firestorm destroyed 3 million acres in Idaho and Montana, and over 1 million acres in Washington and Oregon. The U.S. Forest Service did the best they could in firefighting with very limited resources. Following World War I, the U.S. Forest Service began using planes as a way of spotting fires. Planes were also used in cargo dropping, which was a practical way of getting supplies to the firefighters. Some Forest Service officials came up with the idea of dropping firefighters by parachute, but it was thought to be too dangerous and impractical. In a letter dated July 19, 1935, Regional Forester Evan Kelly wrote, I am willing to take a chance on any kind of a proposition that promises better action on fires, but I hesitate very much to go into the kind of thing that J.D. Bruce proposes, that is, to use parachuters to fight fires. In the first place, the best information I can get from experienced flyers is that all parachute jumpers are more or less crazy, just a little unbalanced, otherwise they wouldn't be engaged in such a hazardous undertaking. Accordingly, I discount materially the practicability of Bruce's ideas. However, in 1939, further parachute jumping experiments were done in the Winthrop, Washington area. The Eagle Parachute Company of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, got the contract to provide parachutes. The Eagle Parachute Company sent the Derry brothers to Winthrop. Frank Derry was in charge of the experimental phase of the tests. Before live jumps were made, 150-pound loads were dropped into wooded areas to see what kind of problems jumpers might have. The Eagle Company people made about 60 jumps, and toward the end, the Forest Service men were allowed to parachute into both open and timbered areas. No serious injuries resulted from the jumps. A lot of time was spent in developing equipment. What they selected was a 30-foot Eagle backpack chute and a 27-foot emergency chest pack chute with quick attachable harness. A two-piece felt padded suit with a pocket on one trouser leg to hold a rope for letdowns from trees, a football helmet with a wire mesh face mask, and heavy logger boots completed the jumper outfit. The name Smokejumper was first suggested by Walt Anderson. This is a fire pack dropped from the plane to be used by the Smokejumper. The first actual fire jumps in the history of smoke jumping were made by Rufus Robinson and Earl Cooley at 3:57 p.m. on July the 12th, 1940. By 10 o'clock the following day, they had the fire under control. The first smoke jumper rescue mission took place a few days later, on July the 15th. There were nearly 100 men who applied for a smoke jumping job who had no previous experience in smoke jumping. There were 16 applicants who had firefighting experience. The salary was $192 a month for 2.5 months. From the 16, 7 were selected prior to any physical examination. 1 didn't pass the physical examination. Earl Cooley was one of the 6. Chet Derry, a licensed parachute rigger and jumper, and who had been involved in the experimental jumps in 1939, joined the squad, making a total of 7 members. Training in the Sea Lake area began on June the 20th, 1940, and ended on July the 30th. By the end of the 1940 jump season, the fire jumps from 2 bases totaled 12. The first season was judged a success. It was estimated that some $30,000 was saved through the efforts of the smoke jumpers. During that winter, Chet Derry developed a static line so that the parachutes could be deployed automatically and thus more safely. In 1942, Frank and Chet Derry perfected the Derry slotted parachute, which helped in steering and guiding the chute. The war years made a significant impact on the Smoke Jumpers program. War had broken out in Europe in 1939. On December the 7th, 1941, there was a Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Former smoke jumper Willard Crable was in high school at the time and describes the day after that event.
The next day I was a high school sophomore and sitting in the high school assembly as we listened on the radio as a high school of about 700-800 students, I suppose, listening to President Roosevelt declare war. And from then on, my high school experience was changed.
President Roosevelt somewhat reluctantly reinstated the draft. While most young men volunteered or were drafted for military service, there were those young men who, for conscience sake, could not serve in the military. They considered themselves to be COs, or conscientious objectors. COs were given the classification of 4E, but sometimes draft boards made it difficult to get the 4E classification.
But all of us had to register for selective service when we reached 18. At the particular time that I was registering, our local board happened to be on a kick that they gave no 4E classifications to anybody. All of us who claimed conscientious objection had to appeal our cases to Cleveland. And so I had to go through the appeals process to get my CO classification. Not that I was unique, but all COs at that time had to do it. As far as I know, all appeals were granted, but it was just something that the Hartville board was doing at that time to make it difficult for COs. And maybe there were a few who were intimidated by it and chose another path, I don't know.
So the draft came along, and I signed up as a conscientious objector. The word came back that I'd been refused. I filed the typical appeal, and the appeal was denied. I had received word on a Friday afternoon that I had until Monday morning to file my appeal, and that this was through the religious advisor that I had been denied. I got the name of the religious advisor. Then the secretary said, but this is Saturday afternoon, and I would suggest that he's probably preparing his sermon. I said, well, sermon or not, I think my life is as important perhaps as his sermon. So I waited for him at his door. He came and I introduced myself, and he said, oh, Louis, yeah, I know about your case. Why didn't you sign up when your brother signed up? I don't think you're very sincere. No, I have no more time for you. More or less like that, just summary dismissal. So shortly thereafter, my father and I took a ride to Jefferson City, the state capital, and went to see the state director. State director, when he heard my name, said, oh, Louis, yes, I want to see you. He said, do me a favor, will you? I said, well, kind of hesitating, what's this favor going to be? Asked me, oh, come on, drop the issue. Just sign up, get it over with. I said, well, if I can, sir, I will. He said, would you do me a favor and write a letter to the President of the United States appealing your case? I sort of breathed a sigh of relief and said, I certainly be glad to. But why do you ask me to write this letter? He said, you have the thickest file in the state of Missouri, and I think a person with the thickest file deserves what he's after. So I wrote the letter. Thereafter, I was the subject of an FBI. I was a problem. Well, the FBI report came back, and ultimately the case was referred to General Hershey, and whether he wrote the letter or not, I doubt, but a letter was written over his stamped signature saying that he recommended to the draft board that I be granted at their decision whatever they judged I was entitled to, but that it had his stamp of approval that I be granted a 4E status. And thereafter, I went back into CPS quite quickly. It took nearly a year to get this process through, but once the decision was made, I was there and the career started.
Early, of course,
When former smoke jumper Luke Berkey took his physical, he learned what the doctor thought of the COs who were there for their physicals.
The doctor that took care of us, or gave us our final exam before we were drafted, probably spoke volumes there. We were a bunch of us were supposed to go in for our final induction physicals, and the local doctor was giving us an exam. It was done in the evening, and there were probably 50 young men, and he took care of everybody, and then there were a few of us COs left over, and he didn't know for sure what to do with us. But here we were in the doctor's office, all our clothes stripped off, and he had given everybody physicals, and here we were still sitting there stark naked, and the doctor came in. He said, "Are you guys COs?" And we said, "Yes." He said, "Well, get your duds on and get the hell out of here." And that was our physical. So that was kind of the mood of much of society, that we were really. Now, and we never did contest it at all, because, but he never did give us a physical.
Civilian public service was set up to provide alternative service for conscientious objectors during World War II. It was operated primarily by the historic peace churches, Mennonites, Church of the Brethren, and Quakers, and the U.S. Selective Service coordinated through the National Service Board for religious objectors. The CPS program was the first time that conscientious objectors were given legal alternative service under civilian command. The program would allow the men to do work of national importance as an alternative to military service. CPS men were not limited to the historic peace churches. They represented over 200 religious groups, and some without church affiliation. In the spring of 1943, the smoke jumping program looked like it might be on hold for the duration of the war. Phil Stanley, a Quaker, was in CPS doing his service in Colville, Washington, when he heard about the Smoke Jumpers program that had recently been initiated by the Forest Service. He wrote a letter to the Chief of Fire Control in Missoula, Montana, the Forest Service Northern Region, with the suggestion that perhaps COs could be smoke jumpers. The idea was not well received at first by the Forest Service, but eventually an agreement was reached whereby all of the CPS base camps were solicited for volunteers. There were 300 volunteers and 62 were selected, most of them from the historic peace churches. One of the reasons for so many volunteers was that by being a smoke jumper, COs were doing something that involved taking a risk, and it showed they were serious about their stand against war. They were not yellow bellies. Men who were not yet 21 had to get their parents' approval before they could become a smoke jumper.
I really wanted to be a smoke jumper. My dad thought it was too dangerous. I told him that it was unlikely that I'd be chosen. I was never an athlete. I'd worked on the farm, but I was not a macho guy at all. And I said, I'll never be chosen. Just let me volunteer. I was in the first group chosen, much to his chagrin.
I always saw the smoke jumpers as being the elite group of firefighters. I was in North Fork, California, and our group fought forest fires in the high Sierras, but we used trucks, we didn't use planes. But I did write to my parents, and I said, there's a smoke jumpers program, and it's sort of appealing, and I might try to get into that. My mama put the letter back immediately and said, don't even think about it. And my dad sort of penciled in somewhere there, he said, Sammy boy, if you jump out of those airplanes, it could break us up just keeping you in clean underwear.
Harry Wyrick was 18 when he was drafted and was sent to the CPS camp in Denison, Iowa on May the 4th, 1943. After getting his parents' written consent, he asked to be transferred to the Smokejumpers unit at Missoula, Montana. In the spring of 1944, Harvey got off the train at Missoula and then went west of town to the 9-mile campgrounds, where he, along with 60 other new trainees, began his training. He received his certificate, which identified him as a United States smoke jumper of Civilian Public Service Camp 103 in Missoula, Montana. Roy Wenger, shown here with his wife Florence, became the first director of the CPS Smoke Jumpers Camp. At the age of 84, he writes, "Of all the jobs I have held in 84 years of living, the one that offered the most spice, evoked the greatest idealism, and has had the greatest trail of consequences was the directorship of the CPS Smoke Jumpers Camp."
Well, the toughest part for me was just the physical part. The training program was designed to build strength, but the intensity of the physical training was so great that I wasn't really sure whether I could make it. There was the calisthenics, all of the things designed, and then learning to climb trees with spikes, and it was just hard physically. In fact, sometimes it seemed almost beyond what I had the capacity for. Didn't know whether I could make it because it was just very intense. But we had one of the trainers was a fellow had been just discharged from the Marines. He was a good man, but tough as nails, and he had no sympathy for people that couldn't perform. And we'd do push-ups until I thought I would die, and then he'd yell and make us do 20 more, and the physical part was just really hard. But it paid off. We were in excellent physical condition by the time we got ready for the fire season.
Just a few calisthenics each morning before breakfast. Muscle builder, the obstacle course, sometimes referred to as the torture chamber. Years of experience contribute to the training routine. This is the backbreaker. Some do it rather easily, while for others it is almost impossible. Most parachute injuries occur on landing. Learning to land and roll properly is extremely important. The instructor yells, "Hit and roll, hit and roll, hit and roll." despite the kinks and sore muscles. Most jumpers agree that the torture chamber reduces accidents. It's hard, but it's worth it. When jumping from the tower, you receive approximately the same jolt as you receive in an opening shock of the parachute. Most jumping injuries happen during the first 3 training jumps. However, more injuries happen playing volleyball than in smoke jumping. On the way to make practice jumps. Unloading the chutes. This Ford trimotor is a great plane for mountain flying. The engines can be cut so that it's easier to jump from the plane. It is capable of carrying 8 jumpers, spotter, and all their equipment. The spotter's duty is to successfully spot jumpers to the safest and closest area of the fire. He signals the pilot his instructions for approaching a fire and also gives the signal for the motors to be cut when he wishes the jumper to leave the plane. He determines the direction and speed of the wind by dropping a small chute. What's that first jump like? We were getting our final instructions for the jump, reports Charles Stucker, when everything in me seemed to tighten up. There were 5 to jump before me. As each one went out, I seemed to tighten up one more notch. Alan Moyer says, if you think you may turn back, you just jump. Anyway, the record is clear. No smoke jumper ever refused to jump. Two types of chutes were used, the Eagle and the slotted Urban. The Eagle has a forward speed of 6 miles per hour. It is easily guided by means of 2 guidelines, which are attached to ear-like lobes of silk on each side of the parachute perimeter. The Urban has a forward speed of 4 miles an hour. Its guidelines are attached to 2 7-foot slots. If one is closed, by pulling of a guideline, the air rushes out of one slot instead of 2, thus causing it to turn toward the closed slot. The slots do not increase the downward speed of the chute. Usually 7 practice jumps are made by a smoke jumper before he is permitted to be sent away in groups to fight fires. Fires are often small and usually caused by lightning. Smoke jumpers don't always land where they want to land. When they get caught in a tree, they use their rope to safely reach the ground. Getting caught high in a tree and having the limb break off can result in serious injury or even death. dropping fire equipment and food supplies for the smoke jumpers. Each parachute is hung up and aired, inspected closely for holes, torn shroud lines, then packed by a qualified rigger. A pack train is a valuable part of the smoke jumper system. The horses or mules bring out the chutes, jumping equipment, cargo chutes, and fire packs of a smoke jumper crew. They often carry extra food to supplement the jumpers, K-rations, and more water. "1943 was considered to be a slow year. Smoke jumpers jumped to 31 fires and hiked to another 16. By 1944, there were 110 smoke jumpers, and that number doubled in 1945 to 220. In 1945, there were severe fires with 269 jumps. The Japanese began sending balloon bombs to the United States in November of 1944. The threat was played down publicly, but was more dangerous than the public ever knew. Fortunately, most were sent in winter and were largely ineffective. The smoke jumpers were asked to assist in the campaign against the firebombs in a secret program called Operation Firefly. Some fire jumps turned into rescue missions.
I was in CPS Smoke Jumpers in 1945. Came out here feeling that this was a better way to prove that I believed what I was saying if I put my life on the line to a point. So I had 14 jumps during that fire season, 7 training jumps, and then 7 jumps, 3 of which turned out to be rescue jumps, and 1 in which actually I hit a downdraft and sprained an ankle so badly that I had to ride a horse for 18 miles to get out behind a pack train, and so had a little trouble sitting down and standing up for about 2 weeks after that. But one of the jumps that was most significant to me was the one in which Archie Keith was hurt. We jumped into an area below a fire that wasn't very large. The valley that we jumped into was full of dead snags and looked like one of those Indian torture mattresses that they lie on. We jumped in there, and of the 8 of us who jumped, only I got on the ground, and that was down between deadfalls that were piled up 3 and 4 deep. And then Archie followed me in the next pass, and actually as he came in, he came over a snag that I had sat over just shortly before, and he hit the top of that, and it broke off at the bottom and threw him like a slingshot into a rock pile beyond the bushes, maybe 100 feet from where I was standing. And he called out, and he said later he screamed. But anyway, I got loose from my harness and my parachute and went immediately over. And he said, "I think I'm done for." And I said, "No, I don't think so. I think we're going to get you out, and we'll take care of it and get you out of here in good shape." So fortunately, we had with us a man named Jim Maddox, who had been a corpsman or medical technician in a hospital in North Carolina, and he was well versed in splinting things and immobilizing injuries, and we made a stretcher with cut down poles, used our jump jackets for the stretcher, and put him on. And feeling that it was getting late in the evening and we needed to get him out, we started out. Left one man on the fire who was a very slender, slight man, and we wondered how he would do with helping to carry a man down through the territory we had to go. Well, anyway, we worked that night through the night carrying him, and being so slow progress down through that valley. And Archie was very stoical. He didn't complain, even though I'm sure he was miserable because he had a rather massive fracture of his femur on one side. The bone was broken in 2 places and then split apart, and an ankle was broken on the other side, on his foot on the other side. We worked through the night, and as began to get late in the morning, about 7 o'clock, we were getting down out of that valley, and we were about 2 miles from where we started. We continued to walk. We did find a trail that had not been maintained, and by about 10 o'clock, we met 2 Forest Service men who had been sent in to saw out the dead timbers across the trail, which was a tremendous help to us. They had seen, from the airplane, they had seen him crash, or realized that he had been severely hurt and wondered if he had actually been killed. So we didn't have a radio on that particular jump. But by noontime then, we had him about 7 miles down to a small ranger station, and they jumped in 8 more men to carry him from there. And those of us who'd carried him all night and through the morning just had to follow them to go the next 9 miles to the road, which had been 16 miles from where we had jumped. Archie was in the hospital for many months, and he did well. He worked on the railroad after CPS and only died just a few years ago. He had a rather tremendous limp to go because of the tremendous injuries that he had to his one leg.
What do CO Smokejumpers do when they're not jumping out of planes?
So for me, it was a great experience. I loved doing it. And I felt I was very fortunate in being able to do it.